Asteroid of fear.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of The Men of the House. And on today's episode, I have Erin Copelan with me, and she is an author. She's a massage therapist. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about her being a caregiver to her spouse and all the difficulties that kind of come with that on the caregiver as it relates to them. How are you doing today, Erin?
I'm doing excellent. Thank you so much for having me here, and I'm excited to chat with your audience.
Awesome. Well, my background is I'm a former healthcare administrator and I spent 6 years in a level one trauma center. So I am very familiar and versed with healthcare and these kinds of issues. So I'm definitely interested to talk about it. And, especially with me getting older, my parents getting older, and both my grandparents having had a little bit of dementia and a history of it, this topic is definitely one that's near and dear to me because I know ultimately I will end up being a caregiver at some point. And most of the audience listening will probably become a caregiver at some point in some form or fashion. And I think it's really just dependent on how much of the caregiver you are in that,
Yeah.
depending if they have to go to a group home where they need 24-hour supervision. But more often than not, with the way medical stuff is set up, even that's kind of unaffordable and unattainable for some people. And
Mhm.
therefore, family members end up being the caregiver. So let's start off by getting a little bit about your background and how we ended up in front of each other to discuss these matters. We'll get kind of into, because I'm guessing this part of the journey is why you wrote the book, and talk a little bit about
That's
that. And then
true.
we'll get into the exacts of what I wanted to talk a little bit about self-care. So give the
Okay.
audience a little bit about your background.
Beautiful. Yeah, and I appreciate that because it wasn't the plan. It
Right?
wasn't the plan. It's not like I grew up saying, I mean, I didn't even grow up saying I wanted to be a writer. And I certainly didn't grow up thinking, hey, I want to be a caregiver and I want to talk to people about caregiving and I want to be on podcasts and get on stages and publish books about it. Not part of the plan. So
Sometimes these things happen.
right? Sometimes these things happen. And so in 2009, my husband was diagnosed with liver cancer. And again, unexpected because nobody plans for cancer, nobody plans for a sickness.
Correct.
And so he went through different treatments. He had some major surgeries trying to hopefully get around needing a transplant because again, no one really wants an organ transplant. It's a very major surgery. And we eventually got to the point where that was his only option for
Okay.
survival. He had to have a liver transplant. And that process for us, it was very scary. The transplant ended up being successful and he is good today. I forget to tell people
Awesome.
sometimes that thing, so I like to throw that in early. He is good, regular husband, annoys me, takes out the trash, empties the dishwasher, like all the husband things, he's on them. But I was his sole caregiver. So in the places that we lived, we didn't have family nearby. We had recently
Mm,
moved, so we didn't have a large friend community. So we were very isolated as a team, but I was unprepared to be a caregiver, and my mental health suffered as a caregiver. And he almost died as part of the transplant. So I went through the trauma of that. I have
almost like
some
the grief.
really absolutely the perceived grief, absolutely 100%. I still work through that because his cancer keeps coming back. It didn't
Mm,
just fix the situation.
right.
And so at the end of all of that, and it was actually 2 years after his transplant that I was like, I'm going to write a book about this. People need to know because I didn't know. Nobody told me. Nobody told me what this was like. Any caregivers that I knew, they didn't talk about it.
Oh, so kind of like a
They
suffer
did
in silence type of thing.
absolutely suffer in silence. I was like, this
It's
is
not okay.
not, it's not okay. Like, and if we talk about it, then like you just said, I'm probably going to be a caregiver.
Hmm.
We are all in some capacity going to be a caregiver. Even if we're not the direct one-on-one primary caregiver, we're going to be once removed, even twice removed. And so even if we're not caring for the patient, we can support the primary caregiver.
Never
And
thought of it
so
that way.
if we understand what it's about and we understand what we can do and we can help ourselves and we can support ourselves in this beautiful village, it hopefully won't be as traumatizing. And so my book is really, it's not a guide on how to be a caregiver. It is very much a you are not alone book. It is, I
Perfect.
see you, I get you. This is what I lived through. If you can learn something from what I did, I have a bunch of sections that I called in
Hmm.
hindsight. It's like, if you can just learn something from the mess that I made for myself, so you don't have to live that mess, that's what the book is.
That's kind of the podcast. It's very similar, and I especially relate it to our younger daughters in that there's always going to be a place that this information is that you can go and access. So hopefully you learn something or you don't make the same mistakes I did. Hence my point of having good quality guests on that have something that's going to be beneficial and offer the listeners. And then, of course, they've seen me in real life make a mess of my own life. So I shouldn't have to tell them, but those reminders are there. I noticed you had said something about, one of the main things that stuck out to me was you said you guys were living in a new place and you were isolated. You didn't necessarily have family or a large friend group. We know coming off of the back of a pandemic that how much isolation impacts mental health. And so as we talk about this, there was a topic in your Podmatch profile that talked about redefining self-care, especially when feeling isolated. And I kind of want to discuss that a little bit in that what is how do you want to redefine it outside of just letting other people know that they're not alone and kind of the purpose of the book and kind of what did you learn from that time in isolation and what's your advice moving forward? What would you tell yourself today if you were thrust back into this situation?
Ask for help. Ask for the help. Because anybody who did surface for me at the time, I put up the wall and I was
Hmm.
fine. I was fine. I've coined kind of four different maybe kinds of caregivers. There's the desert tortoise
Hmm.
who has their shell and they pull into their shell and everything is fine and you approach them and they'll just hiss and snap at you, just I got this, get away from me. And we've got like the barn owls where it's usually smaller groups of caregivers, but they support each other and kind of swoop in when necessary. And then there's like the meerkats. And the collective noun for a meerkat is a gang. And I
Uh-oh.
love that. And that's like those families, like when my best friend had her second child, we all went to the hospital. It was
Hmm.
pre-pandemic, but there were aunties, uncles, cousins, brothers, parents, step-parents, like everybody was in that waiting room supporting her. And I'm very much the desert tortoise. So it was like, I got this. If for me at that time, it was like, if I have to ask for help, I have failed at caregiving.
Ooh.
I should be able to take care of myself and one other person. That should be normal. People take care, like in my
Hmm.
mind, not understanding what caregiving is and the toll that it has, and because nobody talks about it, just that belief of people have done this for all of humanity. So if I can't do it, there must be something inherently wrong with me. And I've learned that's not true. It's not true.
Definitely not.
And so the very first lesson is ask for the help. And as in just the past year, I've entered new caregiving opportunities
Oh.
with extended family. I have learned to say to my family, to my friends, hey, I need help with this. I need someone to step in. I need a day off. I need someone to make this phone call. I need like any of the things. Ask for the help. That's the number one thing, ask for the help. And one of the things that I have in development is actually a series of scripts
Hmm.
for caregivers to access because I know sometimes it's hard to find the words
Yes, that's
to
what I was
ask
just thinking about.
to ask. It's hard to find the words, and there is a feeling, and you don't want to impose on people, and you don't want them to feel uncomfortable or obligated, or because people will say, just let me know, just let me know. And I feel like people really do want to help, but they also don't know what to do.
True.
They
I
don't know
could
what to
definitely see
do.
that.
Yeah, and so I've got a quick little like free download on my website that's 10 ways to support a caregiver. And they can be easy things like just sending them a text of, "Hey, I'm thinking of you today." Because the focus is so much on the patient, which rightfully so, they're
Right.
the ones that are ill. Very few people say to the caregiver, "Hey, how are you?" And so the caregiver can start to feel very invisible, and everything that they're doing can feel invisible, and they feel like they're making these sacrifices and there's nobody there to witness it.
Did you learn kind of, mentioned that hindsight, those little sections in the book. Did you learn, whether it be through personal experience and or research, why it's so difficult for us to ask for help? I mean, I know as a man, it's hard, period. We just don't like to do it. And in my own personal self-improvement journey, that's kind of been one of the hardest parts, but we really especially don't think of our female counterparts as having the difficulty asking for help because females are typically more emotional and they like to talk and they like to engage, where I think men are typically isolate a little bit more. So as I was listening, I'm picking up on that and going, okay, if a woman has issues asking, what is it inherently within us as humans that, keeps us from doing that? And part of me was like, well, is it because as a caregiver, like, hey, I decided to take this on and I don't want to burden you, or I don't want to ask anybody else to accept my responsibility? Is it something like that, or would you find out?
So for me, and I feel like it's this way for most of those who fall into the desert tortoise category. I had very strong issues with codependency and people
Hmm.
pleasing. And so I was conditioned to not make anybody around me uncomfortable. And if I had to ask you for help, Richard, and you were like, meh, no, or you did the thing because you felt like you had to, and it may feel like an imposition, it would horrify me
Right.
that you felt upset or inconvenienced or any other way than loving me completely.
Hmm.
And and then with that codependency, I was also just very conditioned to take care of everybody and everything around me, whether they were able to take care of themselves or not. And so it was just both of those were compulsions of mine. And I've done huge, huge amounts of work on these areas as a result of the caregiving. It was like the mirror for me of, ooh, this how I am isn't working. Because I got sick. And so I said, this doesn't work. And what is the source and how can I fix it? So I've done a lot of work in those areas.
What was the catalyst, and how did you mentioned getting sick? Was that a catalyst for asking for help, or what was the first time you asked for help? How did it make you feel? Why did you do it, and how did you feel afterwards?
The help really has come in small increments, but it's really only been recently
Hmm.
when I've been in these new situations. And so now we're 8 years post my husband's transplant. So that's been my recovery
Now,
journey.
is that a result
It's eight
of
years.
you finally learning to ask, or is that a result of resources actually being there to want to help you?
I actually am going to venture to say the resources have always been there and I didn't access
Okay.
them and I
Okay.
didn't ask. So it's a result of me actually asking and then the people showing up and following through.
Right.
So then I was like, Okay, I can also be vulnerable and admit that I need some help, and somebody's going to follow through. They're not going to abandon me in my time of need because they want to be there and they want to help. So there is a mindfulness about it. Like if you have somebody in your life that you know is not a follow through kind of person,
Right.
and you go to them and you ask for help and they drop the ball, that might not be the person you want to ask for help. Like there is a mindfulness and intention behind who you're speaking to and what you're asking of them instead of just throwing spaghetti against the wall.
I had this thought of like, I think when asking for help, there's a gamut of different things you can ask for help for. So, like, my father doesn't drive, and my wife and I, she's actually works kind of through the Veterans Administration and home health
Mm.
and helping care for veterans. So she might run them to the physician's office or to go get prescriptions or anything like that. But, it made me think of there's got to be this, I think, when you're looking to ask for help, you're probably like, what do I ask for help for?
Yeah.
What's kind of an appropriate measure? Like, hey, can you look over him and make sure nothing happens while I go to the grocery store? Is it, hey, drop them off here? But I also kind of tied in to this is where paths cross and you're going, can I get a little bit of help so I can actually do something for myself so I can have a little self-care? And
Mhm.
so did you find that maybe asking yourself some of those questions were the parts of navigating that determine whether you ask? Because, you might say, hey, I really need to go do this, go pay a water bill. I can't be with them. I can't watch them, or I can't absolutely make this appointment. And so, somebody's probably going to help you out there, but there's a whole difference to go, hey, would you mind coming and doing this so I could go to the gym? Or maybe I could go read a book or grab a coffee. Um,
And I'm absolutely there with you, yet it's the same. And that's the part we get to attempt. Well, we get to practice. It's all a practice. We get to practice it because their safety, the
mhm.
patient's safety, is just as important as you being able to go to the gym. It really is, it is that important because that's the thing you need to acknowledge whatever frustration, whatever feelings you might be having, to move the body, to release those things so that you can return to carrying that person with compassion and love. Because if you can't have that compassion for yourself, it's not going to carry over to anybody else in your life. And so those things are, they're just as important. It is hard to say. And even my brain
I
right
can see
now, I'm
that.
trying to think of the words and it's like, but how can it be? One seems so light and frivolous, and the other is life or death. And but ultimately, it's all supporting. It's supporting you, and it's supporting the person that you're caring for. So they really, I feel like they truly, ultimately hold equal weight.
Have you gotten to that place where you can put that into action for yourself? Are you getting
In
better
li-
at it?
I'm getting better at it in little bits. In
Okay.
little bits. In my most recent, I actually have. I reached out to some family members and said, "Hey, I need help with these things. I've got a therapy appointment. I've got a doctor's appointment. I have to be
Mhm.
in these places at this time and I need help so I can go do those things."
Now,
And I had people show up for that. So
did in this process, I heard you mention therapy. Were you in therapy or did you start therapy during the process as a result?
I was, I've always been in some kind of therapy, like
Hmm.
in or out for since my 20s. I was certain to have a therapist when my husband had his transplant.
Right.
It was just an interesting journey because I mean, I tried to outsmart depression. I was like, if I just go work out at Orange Theory, I hadn't been working out. But
Right.
if I just jump in, then I'm going to outsmart it because exercise helps depression. So I just won't get depressed then if I exercise.
If only
And
work away.
my therapist was like, "You think that was a really great idea to start this very intense workout in the middle of this?" And I was like shocked because I thought she was going to be like, "Erin, you like win." I don't know.
Huh.
And it's not the way it went. But yes, I've always had some kind of therapy support and I really condone that. I know that's also um access to it. I feel
Mhm.
like that's improving, but I know that access can be a challenge. And I know that finding the right person can be a challenge. And so I just encourage anyone who has maybe thought about it, just to know like I've had some really bad therapists.
Yeah.
I've
You
had
hear
some
that quite
really,
a
really
bit.
bad therapists. And I've had amazing therapists who actually gave me tools that I could take home and apply in my real life. And it wasn't just sitting there just blah, 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 blah. So it's worth it to take the time to find somebody that fits with you. So
Now, if people, access and affordability are definitely
mhm.
one of those pain points for our mental health system as we speak. I know that from the healthcare system, they don't like to reimburse it 100%. There's so many factors in what it takes for the doctor to provide care, and that's really all they want to do. But, it's typically the stuff outside of their control that dictates all this other stuff. But if you're unable to do that, I know I applied for TOSA once, which is the Texas Organ Sharing Alliance, for a job.
Okay.
So I'm a little bit familiar with kind of the transplantation process and different things.
Mhm.
Now, during that process, is part of the support? Offer, do the transplant services offer therapy type things? And kind of what I wanted to know was if people don't have this access through whether it's an organ sharing alliance for things like this, the hospital, were there support groups that caseworkers and stuff could put you in contact with for other organ donors or transplant receivers that kind of do the full circle, let you know what to expect, let you know that, hey, there's a possibility of rejection and this is the way it could go.
And there are there's meetings with the transplant social workers when
Mm-hmm.
your loved one is put on the list or you're put on the list. They offer some resources. Most of them do have some kind of support group that they can offer. There's also, I mean, now that social media is out there, I mean,
Yeah.
I recently joined, just to kind of keep my finger on the pulse of what people are feeling now.
Mm-hmm.
There actually is a support group specifically for transplant caregivers. AARP has resources. They run an online support group. A lot of that one is a lot of long-term caregivers who are caring for folks with dementia and Alzheimer's, as opposed to
Yeah.
more acute, shorter term. So there's different resources out there. And again, people, you just have to find what's right for you. Sometimes support groups, they just felt hard for me because I tend to be, again, there's the codependency.
Yeah.
I want to help everybody. And then I'm a bit of an empath. So I take the stuff. So if, some of the groups, people are just dumping their stuff and then kind of go, and you're absorbing all of that, you need to be able to filter the information so that it's actually something that's filling your cup and not something that's taking your attention and actually depleting you. So there's the balance in those. And again, there's so many.
Yeah. Adding more
I just invite
overwhelm
people
is not
to
where you want to be.
find the one that again fills your cup.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I could see that where like a little bit of a trauma dump could seem more overwhelming to the person in there of needed support. And then, not everybody, but in any situation, any group of people, I'm guessing there's always going to be a level of comparison. And some people can be like, oh, that's not as bad or whatever. And, that's not really kind of the place. It's more for support. But even if a person doesn't necessarily think that way, there's still that option of a thought creeping in of going, well, I mean, I guess the only thing you could get from it is maybe my situation's not as bad as theirs, and I'm grateful
And
potentially.
there are those beautiful moments in there too that are those, oh, I'm not alone moments,
Yeah.
that if somebody shares a story or a struggle and you go, oh my gosh, I was feeling so bad because I was feeling this way about my loved one. I was so mad at them and I'm feeling resentful and I didn't know I thought I was a really bad person because I felt that way. And then you see, oh gosh, there's other people that feel this way too. Okay, okay. And there can be a lot of relief that comes from that and a lot of healing that comes from that as well.
Now, when you guys received the diagnosis and were told that, hey, ultimately you're going to have a transplant, but there's some time usually in between that. But during the process, when you get the diagnosis, I'm sure you feel there's some confusion, there's some panic, there's a flood of emotions. But I kind of want to address anger. And did you feel anger at the diagnosis? And I'm guessing there's a level of anger, of course, of, hey, I didn't expect this to happen. This is throwing a monkey wrench. But I kind of want to explore, like, in the process, did you ever get angry with your husband? And how'd you deal with that? Did you ever feel resentful for having this put on you? And how did you kind of work through that?
So the way things happen for us, that was the other reason I felt like I had to write a book because they were just so unique. So my husband had some tests. He
Hmm.
had some blood tests. They were like, these don't seem right. Let's do some scans. We went for the follow-up and the doctor was like, hey, I want you to see this other specialist, but we were going on vacation. We were taking this huge trip to Africa, giant trip of a lifetime. He said, just go when you're back. Don't even worry about anything. So we go on this amazing trip. We come back, we go to the doctor. The doctor just starts talking about transplants
Oh,
and things. And
wow.
we're like, what are you talking about? Like, you have the wrong patient. You don't even know. And she said, well, didn't they tell you have cancer? We
Oh,
were
maybe
like,
that you think that's why they told you to
nope.
go on the trip.
Yeah. And we're like, nope, no one told us. So it was just very interesting scenario. And at the time, and we were both just so shocked. And then we're both like, okay, this is the situation. How do we take care of it? So I personally didn't feel anger at that. I did have feelings that because I like to control situations.
Yeah.
And as a caregiver, there's nothing that is in your control as a caregiver, because I wanted my husband's decisions to be his decisions because it's his life and his care. And then I just had to roll with that. So if anything, there were moments, and I wrote in my book that I said, if I could have taken that bullet for him, I would have taken that bullet.
Hey, this is Hunter from the Everything's Connected podcast. Are you feeling drained? If you're searching for ways to manage stress and find a little more peace, the Podcast Connection Network is here for you. We've got amazing shows on mental health, mindfulness, and all kinds of ways to live a happier, healthier life. Check out the link in the episode's description.
And he's my person. Like,
Right.
I don't want my person to be sick. So it was more that feeling than anger of just this pain. I think, and the recovery was also very scary, and it took a long time. I think by the time the cancer came back for the third time, which was just this past October, I was pissed. I was angry then, because I was like, why does this keep happening? What is the lesson I haven't learned? Like, we've been doing all the things, we've been doing like everything. And the resentment did creep in, because I'm like, I've written this book, I'm doing these things, I'm trying to share this message, and now I have to I might have to, I told myself, I made up the story, I
Mhm.
have to stop all of that because I'm going to have to be a full-time caregiver again. And that made me mad too. And I've also been practicing getting very better at like really living in the present, which is a huge one of those just self-care things, because I made up these stories. We didn't know what his treatment was, what the full diagnosis was, or anything. I went to the place of, he's going to be really sick again, I'm going to have to drop everything and do this instead. There was no both and, there was no, oh, but you can ask for help.
Right.
There was no any of that. And so once I was able to actually get present and be like, okay, this is where we are now, this is what we're doing now,
Oh,
and one step
yes.
at a time, I can I can still be on podcasts. I can We can coordinate schedules, and yes, you can do your treatments, and you know what? He wasn't sick when it like sick, like he
Right.
could drive himself to radiology and get his radiation treatment and drive home. I didn't have to be glued to him in order for those things to happen, because he felt fine. He just had this crappy cancer in him.
Lost my train of thought for 1 second because there's like two things in there that stick out. And the first one is, what do you think of the doctor telling you to go on the trip? Are you glad he did it because of and didn't tell you the diagnosis? Because ultimately that could have been it. But then also kind of going back to this question of where you experienced anger, did you had mentioned that when you first got the diagnosis, you guys were like, hey, okay, this is where we are. Let's look for the plan of attack, look for a plan of action to resolve this. Is it, you mentioned being codependent, but through this journey, you have developed probably a lot of strength. So back then, was it you or your spouse, your husband, that was kind of the strength in that decision? Is he the one that's like, okay, I'm a problem solver, this is the problem, let's solve the problem? Was it you guys together, or is that some, are you that, do you have that personality as well, or were you feeding off him and that's kind of what made it easier?
I do. I think we both have an element of that in us. I mean, I am like, I hit the ground like doing research.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was all of the things, making questions for doctors, finding all the answers. But my husband is the most resilient person I know. He did not, I don't know that I've ever seen him have just an element of, why did this happen to me? Like, he's just like, all right, we got this. What do we got to do? What do we got to do to fix it? And that is completely him. So that was actually an immense source of strength for me, because if he had fallen into a very severe
Mm-hmm.
depression, I don't know what I would have I don't know what I would have done with that. And I know that's the experience of a lot of caregivers. And so to not meet them at that energy is also, I'd imagine that's a real struggle. But I was really blessed that my husband has just had such a resiliency and positive attitude that it really did lift us both. really it did. And for the doctor who told us to go on the vacation, at first I was mad
I'm sure.
because he withheld information. And I didn't think that was fair. I knew he saw something and he didn't tell us. I also don't know if we would have gone on the trip.
And
I don't know if we would have
would
gone.
staying and starting treatment that much sooner have made the difference, and then you just missed the trip?
Yep. And so, and then or we could have gone on the trip and then just worried
Yeah.
about cancer the whole time. And so ultimately, as time passed, I said, you know what? Ultimately, the doctor did no harm. Ultimately, he did no harm because there was no like intermediary treatment that would have saved his life or changed the situation in those couple weeks.
Right.
And so he did no harm. And we had a beautiful experience, an amazing, amazing time. And so now I view that as a gift that we got to have that. And my husband is still okay.
That is awesome. I love that. You know, I was telling you before we started recording that I had interviewed a lady who is a caregiver like yourself. And, you know, we explore this concept of asking for help, of self-care. And she was told, and I want to get your thoughts on this, she was told by 4 different doctors that the caregiver goes first. If, you know, typically in these kinds of situations, meaning that if you don't get a handle, possibly check into therapy, a support group, fill your own cup and put your own oxygen mask first, that it's typically the caregiver that's going to burn out, get sick, something's going to happen to versus the patient. What are your thoughts on that? Do you find it to be true?
I agree with that 100 million billion %. And I don't know the exact statistic on it. I just have talked to a lot of caregivers. I had one caregiver who read my book and emailed me and said, and they were a caregiver for their spouse, long-term in-home care. They said, I have not been to the doctor in 5 years.
Oh my
And
goodness.
your book made me go make an appointment. And we will do that. We will say, I feel fine. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. And it is fine until it isn't. And as caregivers, I feel like we get in survival mode. We're exhausted. We're running on adrenaline. And so we are not always feeling things that are happening in our bodies. And so by the time we feel it, we are on the other side of something that is really hard to recover from, really hard to maintain. And the sickness, whether it's mental sickness, autoimmune diseases, are huge in caregivers because our bodies they were not meant to sustain that kind of stress and discomfort for long periods of time. And so your body will shut you down. When you do not rest, your body will do it for you in very unpleasant ways.
Yes. I say either you take care of yourself or your body's going to tell you you need to.
And when you ignore it, like you get a little headache, it's fine. I don't know. Oh, my stomach's been bugging me. Ignore it. It's going to get louder and it's all going to impact until
Do you have any
can't function.
personal stories you can share with us about perhaps maybe a time you didn't take care of yourself and you got ill and was unable to perform your duties, and how that kind of made you feel as the caregiver because now you're out of the game?
Mhm. I think when it really hit me, because it was my mental health that took
The
the
biggest toll?
biggest hit, the
Mhm.
biggest hit. And that then trickled into the other areas of my life and just being able to show up and having energy and wanting to work, being able to work. But it was the first time my husband's cancer came back and he went for a surgery. I knew the surgery went fine. I knew the surgeon very well from our previous experiences. He told me everything was great. They got the margins and it was amazing. Everything was fine. I went to go see him. It was at the same hospital. I went up to the same floor where he'd been recovering from his transplant and he almost died from his transplant. And as I got off that elevator, started to walk down that hall, I had an episode of PTSD and my body rejected walking down the hall. I was sweating. I got sick. I couldn't breathe, like all of the things. And I finally made it down there and realized what had happened to me. And I said, I am not okay. I'm not okay. My body shouldn't react this way. to walking down a hallway when I know things are fine. There shouldn't have been a sense of worry, but my body said, this is a dangerous place and you should not be here, which told me I had not taken care of myself in the years prior, and I had not healed. So I had not acknowledged the trauma that had happened. I had not taken steps to heal the trauma. Nobody talked to me about it either. Nobody talked to me about that trauma of caregiving, that we're living through that perceived grief, that taking care of somebody, that responsibility of somebody else's life, like filling the pill box for my husband every week. I knew if he didn't get those pills, he would die. That was a life or death situation for me. That every week, that was a trauma for me. And nobody talked to me about that either. So all of that just built and built and built and built. And I was just a wreck, which is not a fun way to live either. Not a fun way to live. And so that's why I talk about that trauma too. Say, hey, these things are real. And yeah, it's only filling a pill box, but it's more than filling a pill box.
Yeah,
It's
because what
more
if
than
you
that.
forget? You know, my dad takes similar, like 31 to 32
Yeah.
doses of something per day. And, you know, his home health nurse comes and fills all that for him.
Mhm.
And, but yeah, you know, with Parkinson's and different things, and you forget. And so, yeah, it's a big deal. But how did you, so once you recognize that, what were some steps you took to kind of come out of that? What was the first
I
thing outside of recognition? Because that's the first step, is saying, hey, I realize 1 and 1 does not equal 2.
I did find a therapist that was more in alignment with what
Mhm.
I was feeling and understood even a more energetic and spiritual level, like what I needed to do to come out of that. I learned techniques like EFT tapping. I learned to identify my feelings a little better. I learned to identify when I have been able to name the feeling, where I'm feeling it in my body, and use some somatic movements to help move those energies and move those feelings so they don't
Build
take up
up.
that build up and take up that resonance, because when it takes up the resonance, that's when things start to hurt. That's when things become unbalanced, and that's when we start to get sick. And so I started working down that path. And so I've been able to build this toolbox of, even if I'm by myself and when an issue brings me some anxiety, okay, whew, I'm feeling this way. And let's go through the steps. And I have tools now. So because just running out for a massage, even though I'm a massage therapist, love massages, that's not going to fix it.
Right.
And just journaling, if you don't have the intention to know what you're journaling, just writing stuff, that's not going to fix it. There has to be that internal connection to be able
Intention.
to, an intention to identify what's actually happening, what you're actually feeling. Because if you just ignore it, again, it's going to show up somehow, some
Yeah,
way,
I
some.
think that's one of the things that I've really learned over the past several years is it sounds so easy, you know, when you said being able to voice or say what my feeling is, but sometimes it's really not. I associate it with a overall feeling of meh or blah. But learning to really label the feeling, understand it, understand where it's coming from and why it's coming has been super beneficial to me, because I think some people don't get specific enough. They're like, oh, I just feel good or I feel bad, you know, but to learn what's really causing that issue and sitting with it, it takes some time, it takes some work, it takes some journaling with intention. But I think once you do that and you learn that, then yes, I think the difficult times can be a little more difficult, because now you know you have to go through this process and these steps to figure it out. And that's the work, that's the hard part. That's like getting to the gym and doing the
Yep.
exercise. But just like the gym, you never regret going. It's just hard to get there sometimes.
Hard to get there.
Um,
And some of those feelings, we have labeled them as, quote, bad feelings. And so you can be afraid to admit that you're angry about something because then you feel guilty about being angry. And so once you realize, I had someone say to me once, I admitted that if I felt my anger, I thought it would take over. I thought it would consume me and I would just be a bitter, angry person all the time. So if I just ignored the anger, it would just disappear. And they said, well, what if I told you that anger was already controlling you? And I went, oh,
the fact you have to ignore it.
because just me going through all of that effort to ignore it took so much work instead of just saying, oof, I am angry about this thing.
And that's okay.
And that's okay. And then it's funny because once you do it and then you say it, it goes away.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
doesn't stay. That once you acknowledge it and you can identify it and feel it, it goes away and it doesn't consume you. And so once I went through that practice, because I wasn't sure, I didn't really trust it. It's like, okay, I'll test it a little bit. And then when I realized it was okay and I didn't die, I
Always
was able
good.
to I was able to bring it
I want to talk.
into my life more regularly.
I want to talk about maybe a few hidden things that you didn't know about. Maybe you to shed a little light, a little thought, but let's say, your husband and not being around anymore, that's all consuming. But then you're going to get hit with these little things like medical bills, insurance, and everything around that. And even if you have, let's say, the best insurance, I'm sure there's still some challenges. So outside of, like, let's say, medical bills, insurance, were there any other challenges similar to that? And how did you deal with them? And any advice for people? Because this is just another thing, another wave, if you will, of something that can come crashing over you in this process. And kind of how do you deal with that? And maybe a little optimistic look for somebody who's going into this situation, if there's any tools or tricks they can organize and not get overwhelmed, even though you will, but try to stay above
Yeah.
water.
I mean, really, everything that comes up is just so foreign and it's things just we haven't done before. Even the language the doctors use, it's like
Mm-hmm.
I'd look at a report and I'd have to look up the words
Yeah.
and to see what they meant. And yes, the medical billing, I mean, that's a whole other thing in itself. Um, food. Food was a big thing for me. And I wrote a whole section on food in my book because making sure you're eating, whether you're hungry or not, energy for shopping, cooking, like it just became a thing. So I gave a list of like snacks to bring to the hospital. So you didn't have to
That's
figure
a
it
great
out.
idea.
But then housekeeping, just all of the thing, getting good sleep also became a thing, and being able to, like, I had to kind of reset up my room and redo my routine because my worry and anxiety had me not sleeping well. And so, okay, I found some amazing apps that help me
Mm-hmm.
sleep. I love those storytelling ones. And I laugh now because I still use them. And the first thing they have you do is take a deep breath and exhale. And I almost never hear the story because once I remember to breathe and relax in bed, I can fall asleep.
It's nice.
And and so, yeah, all of those things that are normal sometimes become hard. One of the stories in my book was me, trying to get the cats to the vet because it was time for their rabies shots. And that's a good example because I think sometimes we feel like all of the things have to be done right now, and we're allowed to give ourselves some time. No one was going to come and confiscate my cats because I was late getting their rabies shots. Okay. They weren't going to make me a bad fur baby mom and take away my children. It could have waited a week, could have waited a minute. That, like, the medical billing stuff, as long as you're keeping up communications and you don't get all ostrichy, like you can't hide from it. But if you're keeping up communication, you can give yourself some time and some space in that area as well. And so lists are very big for me. At least if I can put it on some paper, I can get it out of my brain.
Mm-hmm.
And then reminding ourselves that everything doesn't have to happen this second. It doesn't have to happen this second. We can give ourselves a little bit of grace, a little bit of breath, and it's going to be okay.
Did you ever have any scares, any concern? Were there ever any instances where there was the possibility that insurance wasn't going to cover a drug or a treatment, or did you have to, what do they call, like, appeal, contest anything? Did you have any issues like that?
We did. So when my husband had the transplant, they were getting ready to send him home. They came upstairs and said, okay, I think it's Valsite. I forget what Valsite does. And I think it was $5,000 a month for the Valsite. And I said, nobody told us that. And then they showed me a piece of paper that we signed when we signed up for the transplant that said Valsite is very, 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 very expensive. And
Mm.
I panicked because it was like, I mean, we got some savings, but you have to live. And how long do we have to take this drug? Because I don't know where we're going to get that money. In our case, I mean, the medical center was phenomenal and the pharmacist worked, and my husband is an Army vet.
Mhm.
And so they were able to go through the VA and get a grant to help him with the drugs. So number one, so grateful that the transplant center was like working that for me and on the ground, because I wouldn't have known where to start. But always ask them, always ask the hospital, like, where's your financial advisor? We need help with this. Do you know of any programs? And they there's things that can come up that you're just not aware of that they know about. And so I'm hopeful and that there's more out there than people realize to support.
Yeah, I say that in some of my episodes, and my background in healthcare. My mother's been in healthcare for 37 years, and there's groups of people who dedicate their lives to helping others. You'll find a lot of them in the healthcare system, and unfortunately, you'll find some that not so much, but that's besides the point. The thing is kind of like you said, even working in a hospital setting for so many years, there it is big and complex, and you have to ask. There were probably things I didn't even know about as a healthcare manager sometimes that till you know these programs, these people are out there to assist you, whether it be for grants for medicine, or we would have to get patients medicine and hold them in our fridge sometimes for them to come pick them up through these different programs. And but it's out there. And that was kind of that part of that wave that can be so overwhelming, that can knock you down, because you're sitting there thinking of your loved one potentially passing away, and now you're hit with, how am I going to afford this? I can barely afford to live. And so I think that was kind of great how you explained, ask as much as you can, make a list. And this conversation, the purpose of it too is to help people think of these things. So before they get in this situation, maybe you can formulate a list of questions, and, possibly by reading that book, and that way you're not feeling so overwhelmed, but also understand that, hey, that's still going to happen. You're still going to get panicked sometimes. And being able to have some tools and deploy them to get back to a baseline is definitely key to success in long term. Because if you don't take care of yourself and your spouse gets better, then it's no good. Or if you take care of yourself too much and not enough of your spouse, then they don't get better. So yeah.
There's so my husband and I are scuba divers. And when you learn to scuba dive, they teach you that if there's an emergency and your air runs out, there's a signal.
Hmm.
Like you say, you're out of air, share air, and they teach you to use the other person's breathing device and to actually share until you can get safely to the surface. And I just love that, even more than put your own mask on first in the airplane,
Hmm.
because that feels like, but still, there's that resistance of, but still. And so it was actually just the other day, I was like, no, it's very much more like a share air. Like, I'm in trouble, I can't breathe, share air with me. And you both get to take breaths and take care of each other until you can rise together to the surface to be okay.
So what's one thing, or yeah, one or a couple, anything that you've learned overall arching kind of from this process and experience?
I mean, I learned so much about myself. If I hadn't had these experiences, I feel like I'd be living the same patterns over and over again. So there's been huge amounts of personal growth for me, huge amounts of mental health development for me. That's been the biggest.
What about
And
gratefulness?
so much gratitude. I mean, I still have my husband. I mean, if it
Yeah.
wasn't for medicine, science, compassion of people, for our faith, for all of the things, I learned that I could write.
Yes.
and that people enjoyed reading my style of writing. I didn't know that was in me. So yeah, there have been all kinds of beautiful little miracles that have come up around this experience.
Now, what's one, because I like to encourage people to break out and do whatever it is they always kind of wanted to do, to take that chance. And I believe on every side of that chance, there's something unexpected that you never could have imagined in a million years that would happen that was great? Do you have one of these unexpected things that's come from something that was difficult, hard work that you never expected that you got, that you ran into, maybe a person, place, or thing from this journey and this experience?
I think the biggest for me was because of all of the experiences I've had with this caregiving journey, I was invited to speak to a room full of transplant social workers. And I
That's
was
cool.
invited to share this story with them, to give the caregiver's perspective, to help them think outside the box and how they can support caregivers a little bit differently. And they heard me. And at the end of my 50-minute presentation, they all got on their feet for me.
Wow.
And it was, I mean, I was in tears, because to have these experiences and have this message and want to share it and have people receive it, it's nothing I ever could have imagined.
And you probably never imagined yourself being a speaker doing
No,
that?
oh no, no. No, the thought of like, I'm sorry, you want me to talk to people with a microphone? No.
I love like when you see journeys like that, that whether it be something tragic or not necessarily tragic, but on the precipice of tragic, that people can gain something, whether it's gain a skill, but also like I had mentioned, that gratitude. I think being able to recognize that, understand it, accept it, develop it, just makes what you're able to pour into others as well. Gratitude is a positive something that's fulfilling, even though it seems kind of like this negative concept in a way of like, usually people, it's usually in this negative thing of like, well, you should find something to be grateful for. So it's usually
Yeah.
this negative spin around it. But where can people find you?
The best way to connect with all of my offerings is through my website, which is erincopelan.com.
And that'll be in the
And I've
show
got
notes.
I've got free resources there. You can connect to my socials from there. You can check out my book from there. So everything's on my website.
And what's any works in the future? What are you looking to do in the future other than keep doing this and keep helping others? Do you have any more books or any speaking engagements
Absolutely.
lined up?
I know there's a part 2 to Welcome to Caregiving in me. I haven't formulated it quite yet. And then I've had fun. I've started writing a fiction novel.
Oh,
And
cool.
so I'm having a lot of fun with that writing as well. So that's still in very early stages, but I really have jumped into like, wow, I really love writing. I really love writing, and I get to do that.
That's
So
almost ties into that one part of going like
it
something you
does.
never thought you would do,
Yeah.
and now you're doing it, and
Now
it's
I'm gonna
because
do
of
it.
this. Wow. It's almost
Mhm.
like you probably never thought you'd grow up to be an author.
Nope. But here I am.
All right. Before we hop off, I always say, do you have any questions for me? And it's
Oh my
okay if you don't.
goodness. No, I guess do you have an overall reaction or response to these concepts of a feeling that has come up for you from the caregiver conversation?
I would say initially a little overwhelmed, because we've kind of been in this process through the years. When my wife and I moved back, we initially lived with my grandparents. They were getting older, and they passed away kind of during the COVID timeframe. So we've kind of been in the process already in a way. And then of course with my father, that process too, where it's probably been about 8 years since he returned, but there was a period where he and I didn't talk for many years. And we started talking. He didn't know I had a daughter, different things like that. But we've been able to squash whatever it was, that don't even know why we didn't talk for that long. But that's besides the point. So we've kind of been doing it. I guess it's a little overwhelming in a way, but at the same time, with the experience I have, this discussion with you, I know it can be done. You just have to keep ahead of it, because I did do this episode. It's a joke and it's kind of a play on words somewhat. Being Latino, we live in kind of multi-generational households, and we take care of each other, and it's not typical that we send somebody to a assisted living facility unless it's
Mhm.
absolutely nobody can be around for 24 hours and you're worried about them turning on the stove and leaving the gas on. And
Right.
so it was kind of this thing of going, hey, we're multi-generational households, so you're automatically kind of going to become this caregiver, because that's not what we do. We don't send them to assisted living. So I feel like I've always kind of known it. I know you got to stay ahead of it. And I also kind of feel like it's a privilege because nobody's going to take care of your family member, your child, your spouse, your grandparents the way you would. And it's not saying anything negative about facilities, hospital living facilities, this and that, but that's your personal person, your people, your blood, or somebody you swore in front of God to take forever and support. So I feel good. I feel overwhelmed. I feel part of it. It's like, hey, this is something we're all going to face and we're all probably going to have to do. And if you even go back thousands of years before there was healthcare and all this stuff, we were in tribes and you take care of the people in your tribe. And so I think understanding that, accepting it, getting the information out there, and then plugging in resources like yourself and letting people know what's available and what to expect and what they can do to offset it. And don't be afraid to ask for help. Understanding that ahead of time will put you ahead of the game. And so I think opening up conversations and accepting versus avoiding, because I think a lot of it, with many issues in the world, we can typically avoid it. This doesn't apply to me, or it doesn't apply to me yet. My 10-year-old daughter would probably care less about this conversation. I'm going to be 48 in a week and a half. I care about this conversation. And so it's kind of all those different things. Well, all right. It was nice speaking with you today. And
All right. Thank you so much, Richard.
thank you. You have a good
All
day.
right, stay cool.
All right.
Stay cool
Bye-bye.
out there. Okay. Bye.
Well, that's a wrap. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Please remember to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts from. Remember, go out and be the person that you want to meet.
Hey, go.